Pope versus Emperor, this strange double loyalty of the people of the Middle Ages, and how it led to endless quarrels between the popes and the Holy Roman Emperors. It is very difficult to understand the people of bygone ages. Your own grandfather, whom you see every day, is a mysterious being who lives in a different world of ideas and clothes and manners. I am now telling you the story of some of your grandfathers who are 25 generations removed, and I do not expect you to catch the meaning of what I write without rereading this chapter a number of times. The average man of the Middle Ages lived a very simple and uneventful life. Even if he was a free citizen, able to come and go at will, he rarely left his own neighborhood. There were no printed books and only a few manuscripts. Here and there, a small band of industrious monks taught reading and writing and some arithmetic, but science and history and geography lay buried beneath the ruins of Greece and Rome. Whatever people knew about the past, they had learned by listening to stories and legends. Such information which goes from father to son is often slightly incorrect in details, but it will preserve the main facts of history with astonishing accuracy. After more than 2,000 years, the mothers of India still frighten their naughty children by telling them that Iskander the Great will get them, and Iskander is none other than Alexander the Great, who visited India in the year 330 before the birth of Christ, but whose stories has lived through all these ages. The people of the early Middle Ages never saw a textbook of Roman history. They were ignorant of many things, which every schoolboy today knows before he has entered the 3rd grade. But the Roman Empire, which is merely a name to you, was to them something very much alive. They felt it. They willingly recognized the Pope as their spiritual leader, because he lived in Rome and represented the idea of a Roman superpower. And they were profoundly grateful when Charlemagne, and afterwards Otto the Great, revived the idea of a world empire and created the Holy Roman Empire, that the world might again be as it always has been. But the fact that there were two different heirs to the Roman tradition placed the faithful burghers of the Middle Ages in a difficult position. The theory behind the medieval political system was both sound and simple. While the worldly master, the emperor, looked after the physical well-being of his subjects, the spiritual masters, also the Pope, guarded their souls. In practice, however, the system worked very badly. The emperor invariably tried to interfere with the affairs of the church, and the Pope retaliated and told the emperor how he should rule his domains. Then they told each other to mind their own business in very unceremonious language, and the inevitable end was war. Under those circumstances, what were the people to do? A good Christian obeyed both the Pope and his king, but the Pope and the Emperor were enemies. Which side should a dutiful subject and an equally dutiful Christian take? It was never easy to give the correct answer. When the Emperor happened to be a man of energy and was sufficiently well provided with money to organize an army, he was very apt to cross the Alps and march on Rome, besiege the Pope in his own palace if need be, and force His Holiness to obey the imperial instructions or suffer the consequences. But more frequently, the Pope was stronger. Then the Emperor, the King, together with all his subjects, was excommunicated. This meant that all the churches were closed, that no one could be baptized, that no dying man could be given absolution. In short, the half of the functions of medieval government came to an end. More than that, the people were absolved from their oath of loyalty to their sovereign and were urged to rebel against their master. But if they followed this advice of a distant pope and were caught, they were hanged by their nearby liege lord. That too was very unpleasant. Indeed, the poor fellows were in a difficult position, and none fared worse than those who lived during the latter half of the 11th century. When the Emperor Henry the Fourth of Germany and Pope Gregory VII fought a 2-round battle, which decided nothing and upset the peace of Europe for almost 50 years. In the middle of the 11th century, there had been a strong movement for reform in the Church. The election of the popes thus far had been a most irregular affair. It was to the advantage of the Holy Roman Emperors to have a well-disposed priest elected to the Holy See. They frequently came to Rome at the time of election and used their influence for the benefit of one of their friends. In the year 1059, this had been changed. By a decree of Pope Nicholas II, the principal priests and deacons of the churches in and around Rome were organized into the so-called College of Cardinals. In this gathering of prominent churchmen, the word cardinal meant principal was given the exclusive power of electing the future popes. In the year 1073, the College of Cardinals elected a priest by the name of Hildebrand, the son of a very simple parents in Tuscany, as pope, and he took the name of Gregory VII. His energy was unbounded. His belief in the supreme powers of his holy office was built upon a granite rock of conviction and courage. In the mind of Gregory, the Pope was not only the absolute head of the Christian Church, but also the highest court of appeal in all worldly matters. The Pope who had elevated simple German principles of the dignity of emperor, who could depose them at will. He could veto any law passed by duke or king or emperor, but whoever should question a papal decree, let him beware, for the punishment would be swift and merciless. Gregory sent ambassadors to all the Roman courts to inform the potentates of Europe of his new laws, and asked them to take due notice of their contents. William the Conqueror promised to be good, but Henry IV, who since the age of 6 had been fighting with his subjects, had no intention of submitting to the papal will. He called together a college of German bishops, accused Gregory of every crime under the sun, and then had him disposed by the councils of Worms. The Pope answered with excommunication and a demand that the German princes rid themselves of their unworthy ruler. The German princes, only too happy to be rid of Henry, asked the Pope to come to Augsburg and help them elect a new emperor. Gregory left Rome and traveled northward. Henry, who was no fool, appreciated the danger of his position. At all costs, he must make peace with the Pope, and he must do it at once. In the midst of winter, he crossed the Alps and hastened to Canossa, where the Pope had stopped for a short rest. 3 long days from the 25th to the 28th of January of the year 1077, Henry, dressed as a penitent pilgrim, but with a warm sweater underneath his monkish garb, waited outside the gates of the castle of Canossa. Then he was allowed to enter, and was pardoned for his sins, but the repentance did not last long. As soon as Henry had returned to Germany, he behaved exactly as before. Again, he was excommunicated. For the second time, a council of German bishops deposed Gregory, but this time, when Henry crossed the Alps, he was at the head of a large army, besieged Rome, and forced Gregory to retire to Salerno, where he died in exile. The first violent outbreak decided nothing. As soon as Henry was back in Germany, the struggle between Pope and Emperor was continued. The Hohenstaufen family, which got hold of the imperial German throne shortly afterwards, were even more independent than their predecessors. Gregory had claimed that the popes were superior to all kings, because they, the popes, all the day of judgment, would be responsible for the behavior of all the sheep of their flock, and in the eyes of God, a king was one of that faithful herd. Frederick of Hohenstaufen, commonly known as Barbarossa or Redbeard, set up the counterclaim that the empire had been bestowed upon his predecessors by God himself. And as the empire included Italy and Rome, he began a campaign which was to add these lost provinces to the northern country. Barbarossa was accidentally drowned in Asia Minor during the Second Crusade, but his son Frederick II, a brilliant young man who in his youth had been exposed to civilization of the Mohammedans of Sicily, continued the war. The popes accused him of perjury. It is true that Frederick seemed to have felt a deep and serious contempt for the rough Christian world of the north, for the boorish German knights and the intriguing Italian priests, but he held his tongue, went on a crusade and took Jerusalem from the infidel, and was duly crowned as king of the Holy City. Even this act did not placate the popes. They disposed Frederick and gave his Italian possessions to Charles of Anjou, the brother of that King Louis of France who became famous as St. Louis. This led to more warfare. Conrad V, son of Conrad IV, and the last of the Hohenstaufens tried to regain the kingdom, and was defeated and decapitated at Naples. But 20 years later, the French, who had made themselves fairly unpopular in Sicily, were all murdered during the so-called Sicilian Vespers, and so it went. The quarrel between the popes and the emperors was never settled, but after a while the two enemies learned to leave each other alone. In the year 1278, Rudolf of Habsburg was elected emperor. He did not take the trouble to go to Rome to be crowned. The Pope did not object, and in turn, they kept away from Germany. This meant peace, but 2 entire centuries which might have been used for the purpose of internal organization had been wasted in useless warfare. It is an ill wind, however, that bloweth no good to someone. The little cities of Italy, by a process of careful balancing, had managed to increase their power and their independence at the expense of both emperors and popes. But the rush for the Holy Land began. They were able to handle the transportation problem of the thousands of eager pilgrims who were clamoring for passage, and at the end of Crusades they had built themselves such strong defenses of brick and of gold that they could defy Pope and Emperor with equal indifference. Church and state fought each other, and a third party, the medieval city, ran away with the spoils. The Crusades. But all these different quarrels were forgotten when the Turks took the Holy Land, desecrated the holy places, and interfered seriously with the trade from east to west. Europe went crusading. During 3 centuries, there had been peace between Christians and Muslims except in Spain, and in the Eastern Roman Empire, the 2 states defending the gateways of Europe. The Mohammedans, having conquered Syria in the 7th century, were in possession of the Holy Land, but they regarded Jesus as a great prophet, though not quite as great as Mohammed, and they did not interfere with the pilgrims who wished to pray in the church which Saint Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, had built on the spot of the Holy Grave. But early in the 11th century, a Tartar tribe from the wilds of Asia called the Seljuks or Turks became masters of the Mohammedan state in Western Asia, and then the period of tolerance came to an end. The Turks took all of Asia Minor away from the Eastern Roman emperors, and they made an end to the trade between East and West. Alexis the Emperor, who rarely saw anything of his Christian neighborhoods of the West, appealed for help and pointed to the danger which threatened Europe, should the Turks take Constantinople. The Italian cities, which had established colonies along the coast of Asia Minor and Palestine, in fear of their possessions, reported terrible stories of Turkish atrocities and Christian suffering. All of Europe got excited. Pope Urban II, a Frenchman from Reims, who had been educated at the same famous cloister of Cluny, which had trained Gregory VII, thought that the time had come for action. The general state of Europe was far from satisfactory. The primitive agricultural methods of that day, unchanged since Roman times, caused a constant scarcity of food. There was unemployment and hunger, and these are apt to lead to discontent and riots. Western Asia in older days had fed millions. It was an excellent field for the purpose of immigration. Therefore, at the Council of Clermont in France in the year 1095, the Pope arose, described the terrible horrors which the infidels had inflicted upon the Holy Land, gave a glowing description of this country, which ever since the days of Moses had been overflowing with milk and honey, and exhorted the knights of France and the people of Europe in general to leave wife and child and deliver Palestine from the Turks. A wave of religious hysteria swept across the continent. All reason stopped. Men would drop their hammer and saw, walk out of their shop, and take the nearest road to the east to go and kill Turks. Children would leave their homes to go to Palestine, and bring the terrible Turks to their knees by the mere appeal of their youthful zeal and Christian piety. Fully 90% of those enthusiasts never got within sight of the Holy Land. They had no money. They were forced to beg or steal to keep alive. They became a danger to the safety of the high roads, and they were killed by the angry country people. The First Crusade, a wild mob of honest Christians defaulting bankrupts, penniless noblemen and fugitives from justice, following the lead of half-crazy Peter and the Hermit and Walter without a cent, began their campaign against the infidels by murdering all the Jews whom they met by the way. They got as far as Hungary, and then they were all killed. This experience taught the Christian Church a lesson. Enthusiasm alone would not set the Holy Land free. Organization was as necessary as goodwill and courage. A year was spent in training and equipping an army of 200,000 men. They were placed under command of Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert, Duke of Normandy, Robert, Count of Flanders, and a number of other noblemen, all experienced in the art of war. In the year 1096, the Second Crusade started upon its long voyage. At Constantinople, the knights did homage to the emperor, for as I have told you, traditions die hard, and a Roman emperor, however poor and powerless, was still held in great respect. Then they crossed into Asia, killed all the Muslims who fell into their hands, stormed Jerusalem, massacred the Mohammedan population, and marched to the Holy Sepulchre to give praise and thanks amidst tears of piety and gratitude. But soon the Turks were strengthened by the arrival of fresh troops. Then they retook Jerusalem and in turn killed the faithful followers of the cross. During the next 2 centuries, 7 other Crusaders took place. Gradually, the Crusaders learned the technique of the trip. The land voyage was too tedious and too dangerous. They preferred to cross the Alps and go to Genoa or Venice, where they took ship for the east. The Genoese and the Venetians made this trans-Mediterranean passenger service a very profitable business. They charged exorbitant rates, and when the Crusaders, most of whom had very little money, could not pay the price, these Italian profiteers kindly allowed them to work their way across. In return for a fare from Venice to Acre, the Crusaders undertook to do a stated amount of fighting for the owners of his vessel. In this way, Venice greatly increased her territory along the coast of the Adriatic and in Greece, where Athens became a Venetian colony, and the island of Cyprus and Cretan Rhodes. All this, however, helped little in settling the question of the Holy Land. After the first enthusiasm had worn off, a short crusading trip became part of the liberal education of every well-bred young man, and there never was any lack of candidates for service in Palestine. But the old zeal was gone. The Crusaders, who had begun their warfare with deep hatred for the Mohammedans and great love for the Christian people of the Eastern Roman Empire and Armenia, suffered a complete change of heart. They came to despise the Greeks of Byzantium, who cheated them and frequently betrayed the cause of the cross, and the Armenians and all the other Levantine races, and they began to appreciate the virtues of their enemies, who proved to be generous and fair opponents. Of course, it would never do to say this openly, but when the Crusader returned home, he was likely to imitate the manners which he had learned from the heathenish foe, compared to whom the average Western knight was still a good deal of a country bumpkin. He also brought with him several new foodstuffs, such as peaches and spinach, which had planted in his garden and grew for his own benefit. He gave up the barbarous custom of wearing a load of heavy armor, and appeared in the following robes of silk or cotton, which were the traditional habit of the followers of the Prophet, and were originally worn by the Turks. Indeed, the Crusades, which had begun as punitive expedition against the heathen, became a course of general instructions in civilization for millions of young Europeans. From a military and political point of view, the Crusaders were a failure. Jerusalem and a number of cities were taken and lost. A dozen little kingdoms were established in Syria and Palestine and Asia Minor, but they were reconquered by the Turks, and after the year 1244, when Jerusalem became definitely Turkish, the status of the Holy Land was the same as has been before 1095. But Europe had undergone a great change. The people of the West had been allowed a glimpse of the light and the sunshine and beauty of the East. Their dreary castles no longer satisfied them. They wanted a broader life. Neither church nor state could give this to them. They found it in the cities.